Hi everyone, I'm Mike and this is the Sunday Art Show. This week I'm going to take you through how I created this painting of a black cat, and this is actually my pet cat Limelight. So I created this painting from life working outdoors in the back garden. Now as you can see, Limelight is lying on a towel, and while it looks like a normal towel, it actually acts as a gravity well. It's actually a really important part of this process. So having a towel or a cushion down really encourages a cat to kind of stay reasonably still. And that's obviously one of the big challenges if you're painting or drawing animals from life, is trying to get them to stay, reasonably still. So I'm starting off here with my A4 mixed media pad and a black Sharpie marker pen. And the idea of the Sharpie is it kind of forces me to be as efficient as possible. Because I'm putting down a permanent line, then hopefully I'm going to think more carefully about any lines that I make. Now, in the bit of footage you just saw, Limelight had his eyes open, but I'm actually going to draw him with closed eyes. And because he was, for the most part, kind of not sleeping, but certainly on standby mode, so his eyes were, if not completely closed, then almost entirely closed. Just putting in a little bit of negative space on the blade of grass there. You see that triangle? That's a nice way to kind of summarise blades of grass. And having got the sketch done, I've put a line of masking tape down the open edge of the pad. And I've got my little Inktense Travel kit and a couple of water brushes. Now you can see he's moved a little bit from in the few minutes it took me to go and get my stuff from indoors for the painting. But he's still close enough to the original drawing that I can still use him as reference. So I'm starting off here. So the travel set, as you can see, it's really small and compact, and it actually comes with a little water brush that you can see in two halves within the kit there. I'm actually using full-size water brushes because I want plenty of water to hand. And these work by, my thumb is currently resting on a little button, and if you press that button you can increase the flow of water through the bristles of the brush. So it's a really efficient way to work. Especially if you're limited on time, which I might be if the cat decides to move, or if you're working outdoors, or if you're travelling. It's really nice. And the lid I'm using here as the palette, that works surprisingly well. Now what I'm doing is I'm mixing up some cadmium orange with some cadmium red, and that's what I'm going to start to use for the initial washes on the animal. Now you're probably thinking, hang on, you've got a black cat in front of you, what on earth are you doing? Well, Limelight is black, but within the black fur are lots of different colours, and the more you study black fur, the more you see these different colours. So one of the most beautiful colours he has in his fur is that if he's lying out in the sun, he has this wonderful coppery orange brown colour which really lights up in the sunlight. So what I'm doing here really is, for the most part, I just want to kill the white of the paper. So I've switched now to a slightly darker wash. It's a little more purpley in colour. So even at this early stage I'm establishing something of a sense of light and dark, but I'm not overly concerned. I just want to get some underlying colours down. Now, because we're painting a black animal, there's going to be some really quite deep tones. Now you can see he's moved, and if I come in a little bit closer, in the sun, if you look at his chest there, you can see some of that coppery colour. And on the outer edges of his legs, you can see that there are kind of blue highlights there as well, where the light is catching his fur. So just a couple of examples of how within black fur we get this multitude of colours, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. So going back to killing the white of the paper, I've got the first wash down on the animal. I've got a background colour green I've put up, which is very pale. I've got a mid-green on the left-hand side, and I've got a deeper green in the foreground. So just very simply establishing foreground. Hello, we could be in trouble. He's sort of thinking about moving. So this is where the towel is critical. You see, at the moment there's an internal psychological battle going on in his mind. Do I go for a run or a climb? Or, this towel is really quite comfortable, and I'm relying on that towel to keep him in place. And it actually worked out reasonably well on this particular day anyway. So the ink, I was going back to saying that there are really quite deep tones, obviously, when you're painting a black animal. And the Inktense, for the most part, I tend to put it down with thin washes. So the process for this painting is to build up that depth of tone with a multitude of transparent washes. And that's what I'm doing here. The Inktense dries very quickly in the open air, and it's just a thin wash anyway. And once it's dry, then it's waterproof. So what I'm doing is I'm coming over with a kind of more of a blue wash now, going over much of what I put down as the first layer, and that's gradually deepening the tone of the entire drawing of the animal. So in general, if I had to sum up the technique is put down some light and dark tones and or colours that you want to see included in particular areas. Then do a kind of a wash which will make the image more coherent. So what I mean by that is, let's say you put down a blue, a purple and an orange on the animal. You then might do a wash of ultramarine blue or just a deep purple over the whole thing to kind of pull those multitude of colours together and make them more subtle. And then what I'm doing now, having done that, is I'm coming in with a darker tone to establish more of a sense of light and dark again. Now as I do this, so you can see he's settled back down. Again, not at all really in the same position that he was, but it's close enough that I can still use him as reference. So coming in with these darker tones, what I'm doing is applying the paint a little bit more carefully now. I'm following the contours of his head and I'm following the line of his fur. And you can see on the right hand side of his head, I've done it already and I'm about to do it on the left. I'm using the frayed edge of that brush stroke to help create the illusion of fur. And that's a really fun technique to use actually. Doing a similar thing here for his chest, following the contours, but the multitude of lines, of parallel lines I get from the flat brush helps to create that fur-like texture. You know, we don't have to get into drawing every single little hair, we just want to create the illusion that there's some hair or fur there. Now the one thing I would change on this drawing actually is you can see his tail coming down from the right hand edge, sloping down slightly diagonally left, and then his front paw is following almost exactly the same line, and the two almost merge into one optically when you glance at the thing. It almost looks like just an elongated bar there. So if I was doing this particular drawing again, I would change the pose a little bit, maybe change the angle of the tip of the tail. But he's still staying reasonably still, so you know, believe me, this is a miracle, because over the years I've done quick sketches of him from life, and you know, even the occasional really quick watercolour study with just a watercolour marker pen and dragging a wet clean brush through the paint. You know, he doesn't really stay still for very long unless he's sleeping normally. But I'm mixing up a darker colour now, so going darker again. But again, we're still putting down a thin wash, so much of the darkness you're seeing on the painting, although the paint looks very dark on the palette, much of that is coming from the build-up of layers, of multiple layers. So I've let the paint dry, which, you know, really only takes a few seconds in the open air in the springtime. And this is more of a slightly deeper purpley wash. So this brings us on to the topic of black. Do I use black paint? And in this particular painting later on, I will use a little bit of black just to get the deepest tones. But even then, with that black paint, I will mix in other colours to make it a more interesting black. So I might put a bit of red or green or blue in there, or maybe all three of those. But I certainly don't start off by using black paint. I generally avoid it completely in acrylic paintings because you can get such strong colours. But you know, if I'm doing watercolour or Inktense thin washes, then okay, I might put a little bit of black in there. Now here I'm adding a deep blue. This is more or less pure ultramarine blue, and this is for the highlights, just catching the top of his head, the top of his back, left hand side of his head and left hand side of his chest. And if you're putting highlights onto black animals, then a common mistake people make when they're starting out, certainly I did this when I was starting out, is to make the highlights too bright, because you have to remember that although the blue, when it caught his fur earlier in the video, it might have looked quite bright and vibrant, but that's only in contrast to the very, very dark colour of the rest of his fur. So you're much better off, say you're starting with a darker highlight in general. Although I have to say, if you weren't sure, if you're using transparent media, you could always start with just a very pale wash and then gradually darken it, which in essence I guess is what I'm doing overall on the cat here as a whole. So just continuing with these washes now, making things gradually deeper and darker, but being careful to, particularly around the eyes and on the head, to define the key contours of the face, because that's what's going to give it character. And we still need to establish a structure, within the animal. So you can see here I'm using the tips of the flat brush to just almost redraw certain key features around the eyes and define the bridge of the nose a little bit better. And that's very much something I recommend within painting of animals, is to alternate between painting and drawing. Even if you've still got the brush, you can still draw a little bit here and there within your painting just to refine the structure a bit. And if you find that drawing is too heavy or is making things seem a little too flat, you can always soften some of the lines with a wash, or just simply by painting over part of the line. But for me, it really helps me keep focus and direction on where I'm going, and keeps me heading towards the result I want. A few little defining lines around the mouth and nose. And now I'm coming back to this copper colour that I started off with, but I'm mixing up a deeper version of that now. So this comes back to keeping the highlights on dark animals reasonably dark. I started off with very thin and really quite pale washes. And now that I've darkened everything else, where those pale washes are showing through, it's really not appropriate for the lighting conditions and what we're trying to depict. So I'm adding this deeper coppery brown now, which is more in keeping with the rest of the fur. Now I feel I wanted some warmer and lighter colours in the grass to contrast with the darker the fur, so I'm adding more or less just pure yellow here. And now mixing up darker colour, so I'm adding a little bit of black here, but also a little bit of the deep green that comes with the Inktense Travel set. And I'm using that as a shadow area, just suggesting a little bit of cast shadow where he's sitting on the grass. So obviously I haven't drawn the towel, so I'm having to use my imagination a little bit to create a convincing surroundings for him. And now going even deeper again with a deep blue. And you can see that when I put that on, some of the underlayers are still showing through. And here I'm almost drawing again. You see, I've picked out that line of highlight where his back leg is curled up, just making sure I keep established those key features which make this look like a three-dimensional object rather than just a silhouette of a cat coloured in. So that's what I was saying before. You've got to alternate between getting things to be the right colour and texture, but making sure you have an established sense of form and that you maintain that throughout. Now coming in with more or less pure ultramarine blue for some of the deep blue highlights on the left hand side of the chest and the face. And I've deliberately kept the top of the background that's the initial wash, barring a few wiggly lines I put in very palely to suggest some background plant growth. Some more copper going on here on top. So keeping the top of the background very pale helps to create a little bit of a sense of depth and suggest that there's something going on off in the distance behind him. So again, the drawings, that the cat is occupying a three-dimensional space. And just a couple of touches of copper around the eyes. And close up now, so when this Inktense dries back, it produces a nice matte finish. But there you can see the finished painting in close up. And I'm going to call this one simply It's Quiet in the Garden. So I hope you enjoyed this little video. As always, please remember to like, comment and subscribe. And I hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show. Thanks very much for watching.